My father always said a Blackwood doesn't blink, but he never mentioned what to do when a federal auditor is staring at you like you're a rare steak, and he's forgotten his fork. I sat at the head of the mahogany table, my spine a steel rod, my scent masked by 3 layers of Chanel No. 5, and a desperate prayer to the gods of industry. If Special Agent Miller smelled even a hint of the ozone and cedar that lived under my skin, the biological anomaly investigation wouldn't just sink our stock. It would put us in cages. So I did the only logical thing a fierce woman in a cornered position could do. I lied through my perfectly whitened teeth and signed a merger agreement with the one man I'd spent a decade trying to bankrupt. Chapter 1. The High-Stakes Hustle. Ms. Blackwood, these projected earnings for the northern factories are improbable, Miller said, sliding a folder across the table. He leaned in, and I could tell he was trying to catch a whiff of something that wasn't French perfume. He was a human, but he was a human who'd been trained to hunt things like me. I didn't reach for the folder. I didn't even look at it. Instead, I leaned back, crossing my legs with a slow, deliberate grace that screamed, I own this room and everyone in it. Improbable is what we do at Blackwood Holdings, Agent Miller. If you wanted boring, you should have audited the local library. I flashed a smile that had been described as both dazzling and clinically dangerous. The numbers are vetted, the assets are liquid, and as of 5 minutes ago, they aren't just Blackwood assets anymore. We've finalized a partnership with Mace Industries. The room went so silent I could hear the hum of the air conditioning and the frantic thud of my father's heart 2 seats down. And he hadn't known I was going to pull the trigger on the Mace deal today. Nobody did. It was reckless. It was impulsive. And it was the only way to bury our private PAC accounts under Brian Mace's massive, chaotic balance sheets. Mace? Miller's brow furrowed. The shipping conglomerate? You two have been trying to gut each other since the 90s. Aggressive foreplay, Agent, I quipped, my heart hammering a rhythm that definitely wasn't corporate. In business, as in life, the best partnerships come from the most intense rivalries. The door to the boardroom swung open. It didn't just open, it yielded. Brian Mace didn't walk into a room, he occupied it. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than my first car, but he wore it like a soldier forced into a tuxedo. He was all broad shoulders and dark, disciplined intensity. He didn't look like a CEO. He looked like a predator who had learned how to use a smartphone. His scent hit me before he even reached the table, or a low-frequency hum of pure, unadulterated power. It was a physical blow to my senses, a call to the wolf I had spent 24 years silencing. He didn't look at the feds. He didn't look at my father, who looked like he was about to have a stroke. He looked directly at me. Stella, he said. His voice was a low, gravelly vibration that made the water in my glass ripple. Or maybe that was just my hand shaking. Brian, you're late, I said, my voice steady even as my skin prickled with the sudden, violent urge to either snarl at him or pull him across the table by his silk tie. I was busy making sure the dowry was in order, he replied, moving to the empty chair beside me. He didn't sit. He leaned over my shoulder to look at the documents Miller had been scrutinizing. He was so close I could feel the heat radiating off his body, a furnace of muscle and bone. Agent Miller, I assume my partner has been giving you the tour of our combined brilliance? Miller looked between us, his eyes narrowing. He was suspicious, and he had every right to be. The merger wasn't just a business move, it was a desperate cloaking device. But as Brian's hand brushed against the back of my chair, a jolt of pure electric intimacy shot up my spine. My pupils dilated. I knew his did too. This wasn't magic. It was biology. It was 2 alphas forced into a cage and pretending they weren't hungry. I was just telling the agent how much we're looking forward to the integration, I said, looking up at Brian. He smirked, a slow, predatory curve of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. Integration. Yes, I've been looking forward to seeing how Blackwood handles a real takeover. He reached down, his fingers grazing my jaw as he adjusted my collar, a gesture that was supposedly helpful but felt like a claim. The air in the room became heavy, thick with a tension that had nothing to do with finance. There's just one problem, Stella, Brian whispered, loud enough for only me and the trained ears of the auditor to hear. Your father didn't sign the northern deed. I did, which means this merger isn't a partnership. I froze. My reckless play had just handed the keys of my kingdom to a man who lived to conquer. What did you do? I hissed. Brian leaned closer, his breath hot against my ear, his scent overwhelming the Chanel. No, I saved you. And now, I own you. Shall we tell the agent the new terms? Chapter 2. The Executive Suite. The silence in the boardroom was no longer cold. It was incendiary. Brian's words hung in the air like a death sentence wrapped in velvet. I own you. My father's face had gone from a sickly pale to a deep bruised purple, his hands trembling atop the mahogany table. He had folded. The great Sterling Blackwood had traded his daughter's autonomy for a shield against a federal investigation. Aaron, he'd done it behind my back. I felt the growl before I heard it. A low, tectonic vibration in my chest that threatened to shred my expensive silk blouse and the civil facade I had spent a decade perfecting. Agent Miller, I said, my voice coming out like crushed glass. I didn't look at Brian. If I looked at him, I'd either launch myself across the table or scream. It seems my partner is fond of theatricality, as if you'll excuse us for a moment to align our internal messaging. Miller looked like he wanted to stay and watch the blood spill, but even a human could sense the atmospheric pressure dropping. He gathered his files with a slow, deliberate smirk. Of course, Miss Blackwood. I'll give you 20 minutes. But remember, the audit doesn't stop for lovers' quarrels. The second the door clicked shut, I spun. My hand connected with Brian's chest, pushing him back. You son of a bitch, I hissed, my voice. You son of a bitch, I hissed, my voice barely a whisper but vibrating with the full force of my alpha heritage. You went to my father, you bypassed the board. You didn't just merge our companies, you staged a coup. Brian reached out, his fingers catching my wrist. His grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute. His skin was burning, his scent, at that intoxicating mix of cedar and cold rain, filling my lungs until I couldn't think. Your father is a coward, Stella. He was going to let Miller take you down just to save his own seat. I didn't stage a coup. I bought a sinking ship and put a real captain at the helm. I am the captain, I snapped, stepping into his space. We were inches apart, the height difference forcing me to tilt my head back, exposing my throat, a position of vulnerability that made my wolf pace frantically behind her cage. I built this. I've been masking for 10 years, playing the Ice Queen so your kind wouldn't be hunted into extinction. And you think you can just walk in here and take it? I think I'm the only one who can keep you out of a cage, Brian replied, his voice dropping an octave, becoming that gravelly, intimate rumble that made my knees betray me. He let go of my wrist, but only to slide his hand up my arm, and his thumb grazing the sensitive skin of my elbow. You're fierce, Stella. You're the most dangerous thing in this city, but you're playing a human's game by human rules. I don't play by rules. I play by instinct. My instinct is to tear your throat out, I retorted, though the heat spreading through my body said something entirely different. He chuckled, a dark, rich sound that vibrated through me. Then do it, but do it in the penthouse. We have an audience. He gestured to the glass walls where the board members were watching us like scavengers waiting for a carcass. I took a deep breath, pulling my mask back into place. The Chanel No. 5 felt like lead. Fine, we play the happy couple for Miller, we sign the papers, but the second those feds are gone, Brian, I am going to dismantle your empire brick by brick. I look forward to the attempt, he said, leaning down to whisper in my ear, his lips brushing my lobe. But for now, walk with me. We have a kingdom to run. The next 3 hours were a blur of legal jargon and calculated lies. We stood side by side as the papers were signed, our bodies close enough that our heat mingled, creating a microclimate of tension that Miller clearly noticed but couldn't name. By the time the feds finally packed up their laptops, the sun was setting over Chicago, turning the skyline into a jagged edge of gold and shadow. My father tried to speak to me as he left, but I didn't even look at him. He was dead to me. The only person who existed in this glass tower was the man currently leaning against my desk in the executive suite, watching me with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. It's done, I said, tossing my pen onto the desk. The merger is public. The audit is stalled. Now get out of my office. Brian didn't move. He stood up slowly, walking around the desk. The office felt smaller with every step he took. It's not just your office anymore, Stella. It's ours. And we have a problem. Besides your ego? The senator, he said, his face hardening. He didn't just want an audit. He wanted a sample. And he knows your father didn't give it to him, which means he's coming for yours. Before I could respond, the lights in the building flickered and died. The backup generators didn't kick in. In the sudden, pitch-black silence, I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots in the hallway. It's too many of them to be security. Stella, Brian's voice came from the dark, right behind me. Stay close. The door to my office didn't open. It was kicked off its hinges. Chapter 3. The Dark Floor. The sound of the door splintering was a gunshot in the vacuum of the blackout. My instincts, usually kept under a suffocating layer of corporate etiquette, surged to the surface with the force of a tidal wave. I didn't need the lights. My pupils dilated, turning the pitch-black office into a grainy, high-contrast world of grays and shadows. I could see the heat signatures of the men entering, 6 of them, moving with the synchronized precision of a tactical team. They weren't feds. Feds didn't wear silenced subgear and thermal goggles. These were mercenaries, hired to do the one thing the law couldn't, harvest a piece of me. Step back, Stella, Brian growled. It wasn't a metaphor this time. It was a true, guttural sound that made the air in the room vibrate. He stepped in front of me, his massive frame a shield of shadow. I didn't step back. I stepped out to his side. I don't hide, Brian. Not in my own house. The lead mercenary leveled a device at us, not a gun, but a high-pressure pneumatic dart rifle. They wanted us alive, or at least sedated. My heart was a drum, my blood singing with a frantic, rhythmic heat. I could smell their adrenaline, the metallic tang of their gear, and the cheap coffee they drank while waiting for the lights to go out. Target confirmed, a voice crackled through a comms unit. Take the female first. The male is secondary. Secondary? Brian whispered. And despite the stakes, I heard the dark humor in his voice. I'm wounded, Stella. I thought I was the main event. Focus, Mace, I snapped, my fingers curling into claws I couldn't quite retract. The first dart hissed through the air. Brian didn't dodge it. He swiped it out of the sky with a reflex that was purely, beautifully animal. In the same motion, he lunged. He didn't use a weapon. He used himself. He was a blur of violence and grace, a 500-pound predator disguised as a billionaire. He slammed into the first 2 men, the sound of their tactical vests crunching under his weight echoing off the glass walls. I didn't wait for the others. The third man moved toward me, a stun baton crackling with blue electricity in his hand. I didn't go low, I went high. I vaulted off my mahogany desk, the movement effortless and silent. I landed behind him, my arms snaking around his throat. I didn't want to kill him. I wasn't a monster, but I wanted him to sleep. I squeezed, my muscles tightening with a strength that would have shocked any human. He thrashed, the baton falling to the floor with a metallic clatter before he went limp in my arms. I dropped him and turned just in time to see Brian lift the 5th man by his tactical harness and hurl him through the glass partition of the conference room. The sound of shattering safety glass was like a symphony. Is that all of them? I panted, my hair coming loose from its tight bun, falling in dark waves around my face. My skin was flushed, my senses dialed up to 11. I felt more alive than I had in years. One more, Brian said, turning toward the doorway. When the last mercenary wasn't looking at us, he was looking at the window. A heavy-lift drone was hovering outside the 50th floor glass, its red sensors blinking. It wasn't here to fight. It was here to record. Brian, the drone, I shouted. If that camera caught Brian's eyes glowing amber or my unnatural speed, it wouldn't matter how many mergers we signed. We'd be hunted by the end of the hour. Brian didn't hesitate. He grabbed a heavy marble award from my desk, ironically, a leadership in ethics trophy, and launched it with the force of a cannonball. The marble smashed through the window, the glass spider webbing, and then exploding outward as the trophy obliterated the drone in a shower of sparks and plastic. The sudden roar of the wind rushing into the office through the broken window was deafening. Papers flew everywhere like a snowstorm of white ink. The cold Chicago air hit my heated skin, and for a second, I just breathed it in, staring at the chaos we'd created. Brian walked toward me through the debris. His shirt was torn, his tie gone, his chest heaving. He looked magnificent. He looked like the world I had been trying to forget existed. He stopped inches from me, the wind whipping his dark hair. "You're bleeding," he said, his voice dropping into that low, primal register. He reached out, his thumb catching a small cut on my cheek from the flying glass. "It's nothing," I whispered. Though my pulse was hammering against my throat so hard he could surely see it. His touch lingered. His thumb moved from my cheek to my bottom lip, pulling it down just a fraction. His eyes were dark, intense, stripped of every corporate lie. The violence of the last few minutes had burned away the rivalry, leaving only the raw biological pull between us. "You fight like a queen, Stella Blackwood," he murmured. but they know where you are now. He pulled me closer until our foreheads rested against each other. Because the senator didn't just send men, he sent a tracker, and he's already on the elevator. The ding of the elevator echoed through the dark floor, but it wasn't the tactical team returning. A voice came over the building's emergency intercom, smooth and chillingly familiar. "Miss Blackwood, I hope you're decent. I've brought the warrant for your arrest." It was Agent Miller, and he wasn't alone. Chapter 4. The Den. "Arrest?" I hissed, the word tasting like poison. "On what grounds? We just defended ourselves against a paramilitary hit squad." "Grounds of public safety, Stella," Miller's voice crackled through the intercom, sounding entirely too smug for a man standing in a dark hallway. "There's a report of an uncontrolled biological event on the 50th floor. We have to quarantine the building, and anyone in it." Brian's grip on the back of my neck tightened. Not in a way that hurt, but in a way that said, "Trust me." He leaned in, his lips a breath away from my ear. "He's not arresting you for the fight. He's arresting you so he can get you to a lab. We have to go, now." "How?" "We're 50 stories up and he's at the only exit." Brian looked at the shattered window, the cold wind still howling through the office. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me, a silent challenge in his amber-flecked eyes. "You have got to be kidding me," I muttered, even as I started kicking off my 4-inch Louboutins. "Trust your instincts, Stella. You're not a human in a suit. You're a wolf in a skyscraper. Act like it." Brian grabbed a coil of emergency repelling cable from a hidden compartment in his own gear, because of course a man like Brian Mace carried tactical equipment in his briefcase. He looped it around a structural steel pillar and then around his waist. "Come here." I stepped into his personal space, my heart doing a frantic dance against my ribs. He wrapped his arms around me, pulling my back against his chest. He was a wall of heat and muscle, his scent of rain and earth the only thing keeping me grounded. He clipped my belt to his, double securing us. "Hold on tight," he whispered. "If you drop me, I'm haunted by your ghost forever," I told him, my hands gripping his forearms. We didn't jump, we dropped. The sensation was a violent stomach flip as the cable whirred, our bodies plummeting down the side of the Blackwood Tower. The city was a blur of neon and shadow, the wind screaming past my ears. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second, feeling Brian's heartbeat thrumming against my spine, steady, powerful, and utterly unfazed by the 500-foot drop. We hit a lower-level terrace with a jarring thud, and Brian unclipped us before I could even catch my breath, dragging me toward a blacked-out SUV waiting in the alleyway below. "Where are we going?" I panted, my feet hitting the cold pavement. I was barefoot, my suit ruined, my hair a wild mess, and I had never felt more like myself. "The only place Miller can't follow," Brian said, shoving me into the passenger seat and jumping behind the wheel. My territory. The drive was a blur of illegal U-turns and high-speed maneuvers through the industrial outskirts of Chicago. Brian drove like he lived, with a terrifying, focused aggression. We pulled up to a nondescript warehouse on the edge of the river. It looked like a crumbling relic of the city's manufacturing past. But as we approached, a heavy steel door slid open with a silent, high-tech hum. Inside, it wasn't a warehouse. It was a fortress. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, old paper, and a dozen different wolves. "This is the den?" I asked, stepping out of the car. My bare feet felt the warmth of heated concrete floors. "It's home," Brian said, his voice softening. He led me through the main hall, past several large men who dipped their heads in respect as he passed. They didn't look like guards. They looked like brothers. He led me to a private suite at the back of the building. It was a stark contrast to my cold. "You need to clean that cut," Brian said, pointing to a bathroom. "There's a shirt on the bed. It'll be big, but it's clean." I spent 10 minutes under a steaming shower, washing the Chanel and the city grime off my skin. When I emerged, I was wearing one of Brian's gray t-shirts. It reached my mid, the fabric smelling so strongly of him it made my head spin. And I walked back into the living area, finding him standing by the fire, a bottle of bourbon in his hand. He'd changed into soft trousers, his chest bare. The scars on his shoulders, old marks from a life before he was a CEO, were visible in the firelight. "Drink?" he offered, his gaze traveling slowly up my bare legs to my face. I took the glass, the liquid burning all the way down. "What now, Brian? We can't hide here forever. Miller has a warrant." "Miller has a piece of paper," Brian said, or is stepping closer. The firelight played over the muscles of his stomach, casting long shadows. "But he doesn't have the board, and he doesn't have the Northern Territory. We fight him tomorrow. Tonight. He reached out, his hand cupping my neck, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. Tonight we focus on the merger. He didn't wait for me to answer. He leaned in, his mouth hovering just an inch from mine. The tension that had been building since the boardroom, through the elevator, and through the fall, finally snapped. Stella, he breathed against my lips. Tell me to stop. Don't you dare, I whispered. His phone on the table erupted with a piercing, high-priority alert. He didn't pull away, but his eyes flickered to the screen. What is it? I asked, my voice shaky. Brian reached out and tapped the phone. A live video feed popped up. It was my father. He was standing at a podium in front of the Blackwood Tower, surrounded by feds. I am here to announce, my father said, his voice echoing through the small room, that my daughter, Stella Blackwood, has been compromised by a dangerous element. For the safety of the public, I am officially declaring her unfit for leadership and handing full control of the Blackwood estate to the federal task force. The fire in the hearth suddenly roared, as if reacting to the fury radiating off Brian. He sold us out, I whispered, the glass in my hand shattering as my grip tightened involuntarily. Brian didn't look at the phone. He looked at me, his eyes now a solid, glowing gold. He didn't just sell us out, Stella. Look at the man standing behind him. I looked. Standing in the shadows behind my father wasn't Agent Miller. It was a man I hadn't seen in years, a man who was supposed to be dead. My brother, I breathed. Chapter 5. The Ghost of Blackwood. I stared at the screen, at the shattered remains of the bourbon glass biting into my palm. The blood dripping onto the heated concrete was a dark, vivid red, but I couldn't feel the sting. All I could see was the man standing in the periphery of my father's betrayal. Marcus, my older brother, the one who had supposedly perished in a boating accident off the coast of Maine 5 years ago. He looked different, harder, his jawline like a blade, and his eyes devoid of the warmth I remembered from our childhood. He wasn't just alive, he was the puppet master. He's the reason for the audit, I whispered, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. Marcus isn't just back. He's the federal task force's star witness. Brian didn't waste time with comforting words. He moved with a sudden, controlled urgency, grabbing a first aid kit from a cabinet. He took my hand, his touch firm and grounding, as he began to pick the shards of glass from my skin. He's the biological anomaly they're using to justify the seizure. If he's alive and working with the feds, he's given them everything. Our locations, our financial backdoors, our biology. He was always the favorite, I said, a bitter laugh bubbling up in my chest. The perfect alpha heir, until he decided he'd rather be a martyr than a CEO. Why come back now? Because the merger threatened his leverage, Brian said, swabbing my palm with antiseptic. I winced, and his eyes flicked to mine. The glowing gold and intense. He can't control a fractured Blackwood if I'm standing in the way with Mace Industries' resources. He's not here to save the public, Stella. He's here to take back the throne. I pulled my hand back, the bandage tight. The adrenaline from the fight at the tower was being replaced by a cold, calculating fury. My father hadn't just sold me out. He'd replaced me. He'd brought back the true heir to erase the daughter who had kept his empire from collapsing. We can't stay here, I said, looking around the rustic comfort of the den. If Marcus is with them, he knows about this place. He knows your father used to hunt with mine. He knows the old territories. He knows the old maps, but he doesn't know the new ones, Brian replied, standing up and reaching for a dark tactical shirt. He pulled it over his head, the fabric straining against his muscles. But you're right, we move, now. He whistled, a sharp, piercing sound that echoed through the warehouse. Within seconds, the 3 men I'd seen earlier appeared in the doorway. They didn't ask questions. They simply waited for orders. Evacuate the elders to the northern sanctuary, Brian commanded, his voice resonating with the authority of a man born to lead. Stella and I are taking the bike. We draw the heat toward the city center while you move the convoy. The bike? I asked, my eyebrows shooting up. Brian flashed a grin that was all teeth and trouble. It's faster through the alleys, and harder to track with a drone. The cool air of the warehouse was replaced by the roar of a custom engine as Brian kicked the bike into life. I climbed on behind him, my arms wrapping around his waist, my chest pressed against his back. The raw power of the machine vibrated through me, a primal extension of the man himself. We tore out of the warehouse, the steel door slamming shut behind us just as the first flash of blue and red lights appeared at the end of the industrial block. We wove through the narrow streets of the meatpacking district, the bike leaning dangerously low on the turns. I held on tight, My face pressed against Brian's shoulder, smelling the scent of leather and his own heated skin. He wasn't just driving, he was hunting for an opening. Suddenly, the bike lurched as Brian slammed on the brakes. We skidded to a halt in a dark alleyway blocked by 2 black SUVs. "Looking for someone?" a voice called out. Marcus stepped out from behind the lead vehicle. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing tactical gear, and in his hand, he held a device that hummed with a low, sickening frequency, a sonic disruptor designed to scramble our senses. "Marcus," I said, stepping off the bike, my legs shaky but my gaze steady. "Stella," he replied, a cruel smile touching his lips. "That you always were too impulsive. Did you really think Mace could protect you from your own blood?" He pressed a button on the device. A wave of high-pitched sound hit me like a physical blow, forcing me to my knees as my vision blurred. Through the ringing in my ears, I saw Marcus signal to his men. "Kill the Alpha," Marcus commanded, pointing at Brian, "and bring my sister home. We have a lot to discuss." Chapter 6. The Sonic Trap. The world was a vibrating mess of gray and white noise, and every nerve in my body felt like it was being scraped by a dull blade. The sonic disruptor Marcus held was tuned specifically to our frequency, a weapon designed to turn our heightened senses against us. I collapsed onto the wet pavement, my hands over my ears, but the sound was inside my skull. It felt like my brain was trying to vibrate its way out of my ears. Beside me, Brian was struggling. He hadn't fallen, his alpha sheer will keeping him upright, but his face was contorted in agony. His jaw locked so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. He tried to move toward Marcus, but his legs buckled, and he dropped to one knee, the bike toppling over with a heavy metallic crash. "Pathetic," Marcus sneered, stepping closer. The light from the SUV headlights silhouetted him, making him look like a dark god of the underworld. 5 years of hiding, and this is what the Blackwood name has come to. Cowering in an alley with a mace, he kicked the bike's front tire, and the sound echoing hollowly. "The feds think you're a monster, Stella, but I know the truth. You're just a girl playing dress-up in a world that belongs to men like me." The rage that surged through me was hotter than the pain. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the condescension. He thought I was weak because I had spent my life building while he had spent his hiding. I forced my eyes open, my vision swimming. I looked at Brian. He was staring at me, his eyes burning a frantic, glowing gold. And he wasn't giving up, he was waiting for an opening. "Marcus," I gasped out, the word feeling like a mouthful of glass. "You don't know anything." I focused everything I had on the one thing Marcus had always underestimated, my discipline. I didn't try to fight the sound. I tried to find the silence beneath it. I reached into the cold, analytical part of my mind, the part that ran boardrooms and managed billions. I visualized the sound waves as data. Then I found the frequency of my own heartbeat. I lunged. I didn't go for Marcus. I went for the device. I wasn't fast enough to be a blur, but I was fast enough to catch him off guard. My hand clamped over his wrist, my nails digging into his skin. He snarled, trying to shake me off, but I was a Blackwood, and I didn't blink. I twisted his arm, the bone popping with a sickening sound. The device clattered to the ground, the frequency cutting off instantly. The silence was deafening. And Brian was up in a heartbeat. He didn't wait for Marcus to recover. He slammed into my brother with the force of a freight train, pinning him against the hood of the lead SUV. The metal buckled under the impact. Brian's hand was at Marcus's throat, his eyes glowing with a feral, murderous light. "Give me one reason," Brian growled, the sound vibrating through the alley. "Give me one reason why I shouldn't end this legacy right here." "Go ahead," Marcus gasped, his face turning a deep purple. Kill me. The feds are recording everything. You'll be a public execution by morning." "Brian, stop," I shouted, stumbling to my feet. My head was still spinning, but I knew Marcus was right. This was a trap. The SUVs weren't just transport. They were mobile broadcasting units. Brian's muscles were knotted, his instincts screaming for the kill. He looked at me, the conflict in his eyes a raw, bleeding thing. He wanted Marcus dead, but he wanted me safe more. With a roar of frustration, he threw Marcus aside. My brother hit the pavement hard, coughing and gasping for air. "We go," Brian said, grabbing my hand. He didn't look back at the bike. It was compromised. He led me toward the mouth of the alley, toward the labyrinth of the city's underground freight tunnels. We ran through the darkness, the sound of our boots echoing off the damp brick walls. We didn't stop until we reached a rusted steel door marked Private. Brian pulled a keycard from his pocket, a Mace Industries master, and swiped it. We burst into a small, windowless security room. It was filled with monitors, most of them showing the chaos unfolding at the Blackwood Tower. But one screen showed something else. It was a live map of the city, with dozens of red dots converging on our position. "They're tracking the scent," Brian said, his voice grim. He looked at me, his eyes softening for a brief second. "Stella, they've mapped your DNA. They aren't just looking for you. They're looking for the biological signature of the Blackwood heir." "Then we give it to them," I said, a desperate plan forming in my mind. "But not here." I grabbed a pair of industrial shears from a workbench. Before Brian could stop me, I sliced a deep cut across my forearm, letting the blood spray across a pile of old rags. "Stella, what are you doing?" "A decoy," I said, wrapping the rags around a small drone I found in a corner. "If they want my DNA, let's give them a trail to follow." I launched the drone through a ventilation shaft, watching it disappear into the night. But as I turned back to Brian, the monitors suddenly flickered. A new image appeared. It was my father, but he wasn't at the podium anymore. He was in a cage, and Marcus was standing over him, a syringe in his hand. "The bait has changed," Marcus's voice came through the speakers. "Your father was the first to fall, Stella. You're next. Or unless you want to see what happens when an alpha is forced to shift in a room full of scientists." Chapter 7. The Blood Exchange. The sight of my father caged like a common beast should have sparked some remnant of daughterly devotion, but all I felt was a cold, clinical horror. Marcus wasn't just taking the company. He was turning our very existence into a laboratory experiment. He wanted to strip away the mask of humanity once and for all, not for the sake of truth. "Force a shift," Brian said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He stood close behind me, his heat a stark contrast to the chilled air of the security room. "If he injects Sterling with a concentrated adrenal stimulant, your father won't be able to hold the human form. The cameras will catch every bone breaking, every hair sprouting. It will be the end of us. And Marcus will be the one who contained the threat," I finished, my mind racing. "He'll be the hero who saved Chicago from the wolves in suits." I looked at my arm, the blood still seeping through the makeshift bandage. The decoy drone was already miles away, drawing the perimeter teams toward the lakefront, but it wouldn't stop Marcus. He was already inside the tower, in the secure labs my father had built for medical research, at the very labs that were now his prison. "Brian, look at the sensor readings," I said, pointing to a sub-monitor. "Marcus isn't just using an adrenal stimulant. Look at the chemical signature. That's a Mace Industries compound, V9. Brian's face went white. "That was a prototype, a neural suppressant for injured pack members. We scrapped it because it was too unstable. In high doses, it doesn't just suppress the wolf. It burns out the nervous system." "He's not just trying to force a shift," I whispered. "He's going to kill him on live television and call it a necessary containment." Brian turned to me, his hands gripping my shoulders. His eyes were no longer gold. They were a deep, swirling amber, filled with a desperate, protective fire. "Stella, we can't go back to the tower. It's a kill zone. Every federal agent in the state is centered there." "I'm not going back to save my father, Brian," I said, stepping into his space, my voice hardening. "I'm going back to finish what I started in that boardroom. I am the CEO of Blackwood Mace, and I don't let rivals or brothers destroy my assets." I reached up, my hand cupping the back of his neck. The intimacy of the moment felt surreal amidst the blinking lights and the threat of death. "We need a diversion, something bigger than a drone." "What are you thinking?" "The merger," I said. "It wasn't just a legal contract, Brian. It was a biological one. We've been sharing space, scent, and blood for days. Our packs are already beginning to sync. If we trigger a collective territorial response, we can override the local comms and cause a blackout of the entire downtown grid." "A pack-wide howl," Brian said, a slow, dark smile spreading across his face. "Without the magic, but with all the power." We didn't have much time. Brian accessed the Mace Industries emergency broadcast frequency, a secure line used to coordinate pack movements during crises. He didn't say a word. He just breathed into the receiver, a rhythmic, low-frequency hum that signaled the alpha call. Across the city, in the warehouses, the factories, and the high-rise apartments, the wolves of Chicago heard the call. They didn't shift. They didn't howl into the night. They simply stopped what they were doing and focused. And the collective psychic weight of several hundred alphas and betas focusing on a single point, the Blackwood Tower, began to warp the local electromagnetic field. The monitors in our security room began to static. "It's working," I said. the hair on my arm standing up. We left the security room, heading up the service stairs toward the street level. As we emerged into the cool night air, the city began to go dark. One block at a time, the streetlights flickered and died. The electronic locks were dead, killed by the blackout. We climbed the stairs, our lungs burning, our hearts a synchronized drumbeat. When we reached the laboratory floor, the smell hit me, the sterile scent of chemicals mixed with the metallic tang of fear. That we burst through the double doors. Marcus was standing over the cage, the syringe inches from our father's neck. He turned, his face illuminated by the red emergency lights. "You're late, Stella," Marcus said, his voice calm, almost bored. "The show is about to start." He plunged the needle into Sterling's neck. My father let out a sound that wasn't human. His body began to contort, his suit jacket tearing as his muscles expanded. But it wasn't a clean shift. It was a mess of bone and fur. It's a nightmare of biology. "Now," Marcus said, looking at a camera lens on the wall, "witness the monster." But the camera wasn't recording. The screen on the wall showed only static. "The blackout, Marcus," I said, stepping forward, my claws finally extending fully. "Nobody's watching, except us." Brian lunged, but Marcus was ready. He pulled a second syringe from his pocket, one filled with a bright blue liquid. "Then I'll just have to settle for the pair of you," Marcus said. He didn't aim for Brian. He threw the syringe at me. Brian dived to intercept it, the needle burying itself in his shoulder. He let out a choked sound and collapsed to the floor, his body instantly seizing as the V9 hit his system. "Brian!" I screamed. Marcus laughed, pulling a tactical knife from his belt. "Now, sister, let's see who the real alpha is." Chapter 8. The Weight of the Crown. Brian hit the floor with a sound that felt like my own heart shattering. The V9 wasn't a sedative, and it was a neurotoxic cage. I watched, paralyzed for a heartbeat, as his powerful frame locked up, muscles corded and twitching beneath his skin. His eyes, usually so full of fire and command, were blown wide, fixed on the ceiling in a silent scream of agony. Marcus had calculated this perfectly. He knew Brian wouldn't let a needle touch me. He had used the alpha's protective instinct as a literal weapon. "You always were the sentimental one, Stella," Marcus said, testing the edge of his tactical knife with a thumb. He stepped over Brian's paralyzed body as if he were nothing more than a discarded piece of office furniture. "Our father taught us that attachments are vulnerabilities. It seems you didn't listen. And look at your partner now, a 500-pound paperweight." I didn't look at the knife. I didn't look at my father, who was still groaning in the cage, a half-shifted nightmare of gray fur and shredded pinstripes. I looked at Marcus, at the brother who had shared my nursery, who had taught me how to hide my scent when we were children, was gone. In his place was a shell of a man fueled by a decade of resentment and a hunger for a throne he hadn't earned. "You think I'm vulnerable because I care?" I said, my voice dropping into a register that made the emergency sirens in the hallway sound like a whisper. I kicked my ruined heels aside, my bare feet finding purchase on the cold, sterile linoleum. "That you've been gone for 5 years, Marcus. You missed the part where I stopped being the daughter and started being the storm." I didn't wait for him to lunge. I moved. Without the magic of the moon or the fluff of a fairy tale, my speed was simply the result of superior biology pushed to the absolute limit. I was a blur of charcoal silk and fury. I didn't go for the knife. I went for his center of gravity. I slammed into him, my shoulder connecting with his ribs with a sickening crack. And we went down together, sliding across the blood-slicked floor. Marcus was stronger than he looked, his tactical training giving him a technical edge that my boardroom sparring hadn't prepared me for. He rolled, bringing the knife up in a sweeping arc. The blade whistled past my throat, close enough to part the fine hairs on my neck. I scrambled back, my breath coming in sharp, jagged hitches. "Is that it?" Marcus taunted, regaining his feet with a fluid grace. A little tackle. Sterling really did let the bloodline go soft. He lunged again, a series of rapid-fire stabs that forced me to retreat toward the cages. I could hear the wet, heavy breathing of my father behind me. The V9 was doing its work on him too. The force shift was stalling, leaving him in a state of permanent, agonizing transition. I backed into a rolling equipment cart, my fingers frantically searching for anything to use as a weapon. My hand closed around a heavy glass carboy of saline. As Marcus stepped in for the kill, I swung it with every ounce of alpha strength I possessed. It shattered against his forearm, drenching him in salt water and glass shards. He hissed in pain, his grip on the knife loosening for a fraction of a second. That was all the opening I needed. I surged forward, grabbing his wrist and twisting it until the bone groaned. I drove my knee into his solar plexus, knocking the air from his lungs. For a moment, I had the upper hand. I could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that the girl he remembered was long gone. But Marcus had one more card to play. He reached for his belt, clicking a remote. A high-pitched whine erupted from the lab's speakers, not the sonic disruptor from the alley, but something worse. It was a frequency designed to trigger the V9 in the system. Beside me, Brian's body arched off the floor, a guttural, choked sound escaping his throat. His skin began to darken, the veins in his neck bulging as the toxin began to cook him from the inside out. "The more you fight, the faster he dies," Marcus choked out, a bloody grin on his face. "The frequency accelerates the neural burnout. Drop the knife, Stella, or watch your alpha turn into a vegetable before your eyes." I looked at Brian, then back at Marcus. My hand was trembling. The fierce woman I had become was suddenly staring at the one choice she couldn't make. 3 seconds, Stella," Marcus whispered. "Our 2, 1. The laboratory doors didn't open. They exploded inward as a black-clad figure vaulted into the room, but it wasn't a wolf. Chapter 9. The Ghost Protocol. The figure moved with a mechanical, terrifying precision that put Marcus's tactical training to shame. It was a woman draped in matte black polymer armor, her face hidden behind a high-tech visor. She didn't say a word. She fired a weighted net from a wrist-mounted launcher, pinning Marcus against the wall before he could react. The remote fell from his hand, clattering across the floor toward the drainage grates. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, standing over Brian, my claws still out, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The woman ignored me. She stepped over Marcus, who was thrashing like a landed fish in the electrified netting, and knelt beside Brian. She pulled a small pressurized canister from her utility belt and slammed it into his neck. "Neutralizing agent," she said. Her voice filtered through a synthesizer, sounding like a digital ghost. "V9 is a Blackwood Mace hybrid. This is the only thing that stops the burnout." I watched, my breath held, as Brian's body finally went limp. The violent tremors subsided, replaced by the slow, heavy rise and fall of his chest. His eyes closed, and for the first time in an hour, he looked like he was merely sleeping. "Why are you helping us?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of adrenaline and suspicion. The woman stood up, her visor retracting to reveal a face I hadn't seen in a decade. It was Sarah, my mother's former head of security, a woman who had vanished the night my mother died. She looked older, her skin scarred, but her eyes were as sharp and uncompromising as ever. "I'm not helping you, Stella," Sarah said, her voice raw. "I'm fulfilling a contract. Your mother knew this day would come. She knew Sterling was a coward and Marcus was a sociopath. Because she built a ghost protocol for when the tower fell." She turned to Marcus, who was now unconscious in the net. "He's been working with a splinter cell of the federal government. They don't want to study you. They want to weaponize the shift. They want an army that doesn't need a supply chain." "And my father?" I looked at the cage. Sterling had stopped groaning. He was slumped against the bars, a pathetic, half-transformed heap of a man who had sold his soul for a seat at a table that no longer existed. "Sterling is a casualty of his own greed," Sarah said coldly. "The V9 Marcus gave him was a lethal dose. He's gone, Stella. Even if his heart is still beating, the man you called father is dead." A heavy rhythmic thumping started overhead. The ventilation shafts began to rattle. "Extraction teams," Sarah noted, checking a display on her wrist. "They're bypassing the blackout. They've got heavy lift helicopters on the roof. We have 3 minutes to get to the sub-basement before they gas the floor." "I'm not leaving him," I said, pointing to Brian. "Then carry him," Sarah snapped. "I'm busy making sure Marcus doesn't wake up before I can hand him over to the people who actually know how to keep a monster in a box." I didn't argue. I knelt beside Brian, slipping my arms under his. He was a dead weight of muscle and bone, but the adrenaline coursing through me gave me a strength I didn't know I possessed. I hauled him up, his head lolling onto my shoulder, his scent of rain and earth filling my senses and giving me the focus I needed. We moved toward the service elevator, Sarah clearing the way with a series of flashbangs that turned the hallway into a whiteout of noise and light. We reached the sub-basement just as the first canisters of gas began to hiss into the vents above us, and we reached a hidden dock at the river level, where a sleek, blacked-out boat was idling. Sarah threw Marcus into the hold like a bag of laundry and signaled for me to get Brian on board. "Where does this lead?" I panted, my muscles screaming in protest. "Outside the city limits," Sarah said, jumping behind the wheel. "The merger is dead, Stella. The Blackwood name is cursed. You have nothing left in Chicago but a pile of glass and a warrant." I have the Mace assets, I said, looking down at Brian as he started to stir, and I have the only man who knows how to run them. As the boat roared to life, a searchlight from above hit the water. A voice boomed over a megaphone from the helicopters circling the tower. Stella Blackwood, this is the Federal Task Force. We have your brother. Surrender now, or we will authorize lethal force on the Mace Industry Holdings. I looked at Marcus in the hold. He was still out. Then I looked at the helicopters. Sarah, I said, my voice cold. Who exactly is on that megaphone? That's the senator, Sarah replied, the one Marcus was working for. I looked down at the man in the hold again. My blood ran cold. The man Sarah had grabbed wasn't Marcus. It was a decoy in Marcus's gear. The real Marcus was still in the tower, and he was currently holding the remote to the boat. Chapter 10. The River's Edge. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The Marcus Sarah had neutralized was a plant, and a tactical distraction designed to lead us exactly where the real Marcus wanted us. Trapped on a vessel in the middle of the Chicago River with no cover and a direct line of sight from the air, Sarah's eyes went wide as she realized the mistake, her hands flying over the controls, but the engine didn't roar. It died with a pathetic mechanical wheeze. The remote, I whispered, looking back at the dark silhouette of the Blackwood Tower. He's still up there. He let us leave. He didn't let us leave, Brian's voice came from the floor of the boat, gravelly and weak but filled with a sudden, sharp clarity. He sat up, his hand going to his neck where the neutralizing agent had been injected. He exported us. We're the target now. The searchlight from the helicopter above intensified, turning the deck of the boat into a stage. The senator's voice boomed again, devoid of any pretense of law or order. Final warning, Stella. The Mace factories are already being cordoned off. Your pack is being labeled a domestic terror cell. Surrender or watch the world burn from the water. I'm going to kill him, I said, my hands curling into fists so tight my nails drew blood. I'm going to climb back up that tower and tear his heart out. You won't make it to the lobby, Sarah said, her voice tight as she pulled a heavy-caliber rifle from a hidden locker. We're sitting ducks. Brian, can you shift? Brian stood up, his legs shaking, but his gaze fixed on the searchlight. The V9 burned out the trigger. I'm human until the chemical clears my system. At least an hour, maybe 2. We don't have 2 minutes, I said, looking at the water. The river was dark and fast, the current pulling us toward the locks. Brian, the factories. If they're cordoning them off, they're going after the families. The den. Brian's jaw set, his alpha instinct flaring in his eyes despite his physical weakness. They won't get in. My people know the drill, but they can't hold out against federal tanks. They don't have to, I said, a desperate, reckless plan forming in my mind. I looked at the decoy Marcus in the hold. He was waking up, his eyes darting around in confusion. He was just a mercenary, a body in a suit. Sarah, does this boat have a self-destruct? It's a prototype. It has a thermal scuttle charge, she said, her eyes narrowing. Why? Because the senator thinks Marcus is on this boat, I said. I'm grabbing the mercenary by the collar and hauling him to the center of the deck where the searchlight was brightest. And Marcus wants the senator to think he's won. We're going to give them both exactly what they want. I looked at Brian. We jump. Now. We let the current take us to the Mace docks. Sarah, set the charge for 30 seconds. Stella, if we jump now, they'll see us in the light, Brian argued. Not if we give them something else to look at. I looked at the mercenary. Sorry. Our buddy, occupational hazard. I shoved the mercenary toward the stern and triggered the emergency flares on the boat's rail. The deck was suddenly engulfed in a blinding red phosphorus glow, masking our movements from the thermal cameras above. Go, I shouted. We dived into the freezing, oily water of the Chicago River, just as the boat's scuttle charge detonated. The explosion was a beautiful, violent orange bloom that reflected off the glass of the surrounding skyscrapers. As the shockwave rolled over us, pushing us deep beneath the surface, the water was a silent, numbing void. I kicked hard, my lungs screaming, my hands searching for Brian's in the dark. I found his wrist, his grip tightening around mine with a strength that told me the adrenaline was finally overriding the V9. We swam toward the shadows of the old industrial piers, the sound of the helicopters circling the wreck behind us. We pulled ourselves onto a rusted metal ladder, shivering and gasping for air. The city was still dark, the blackout holding firm, but the sky was filled with the red and blue strobes of 100 emergency vehicles. They think we're dead, Brian panted, his arm around my waist as we stumbled into the shadows of an abandoned warehouse. For now. Good, I said. wringing the freezing water from my hair. Because Marcus is still in my chair, and I want my office back. I looked at the Blackwood Tower, glowing like a tombstone in the distance. "Brian," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper, "the merger isn't dead. We're just moving to the hostile phase." Before he could respond, my phone, waterproof and still buzzing in my pocket, lit up. It wasn't a call, it was a broadcast. The senator wasn't on the megaphone anymore. He was on every screen in the city that still had power. And he wasn't alone. Marcus was standing beside him, holding a piece of paper. "By the authority of the Blackwood estate," Marcus's voice echoed through the empty warehouse, "I hereby declare a state of emergency. All Mace Industries assets are now property of the federal government, and any wolf found on the streets will be dealt with as a stray." The screen shifted to a live feed of the den. The doors were being kicked in, but it wasn't the feds. It was a pack of wolves I didn't recognize. Wolves with cold, white eyes. "Who are they?" I whispered. "The butcher's pack," Brian growled, his scent turning sharp and bitter. "Marcus didn't just bring the feds. He brought mercenaries from the north, the kind who don't care about suits or boardrooms." The leader of the white-eyed wolves stepped into the camera's view. He looked directly into the lens, as if he knew we were watching. "Stella Blackwood," he said, his voice a low, terrifying snarl. "I have your father's head. Come and get the rest of him." Chapter 11. The Northern Breach. The image of the white-eyed wolf on my phone screen felt like a physical violation of the sanctuary we had built. My father was gone, not just stripped of his power, but literally decimated by a faction that didn't know the meaning of the word corporate. Beside me, Brian's hand crushed a rusted railing, the metal groaning under the pressure of his returning strength. The V9 was finally flushing from his system, replaced by a cold, concentrated pheromone of war. "The butcher," Brian spat, at the name sounding like a curse. "He's a mercenary from the Yukon. He doesn't believe in the mask, Stella. He believes in the blood. Marcus didn't just sell us out. He invited a plague into the city. He thinks he can use them to clear the board," I said, my voice eerily calm as I wrung the freezing river water from my silk shirt. The Ice Queen was back, but this time the ice was sharp enough to kill. "He wants the butcher to do the dirty work while he sits in the tower and signs the cleanup contracts. We have to get to the den, now." We didn't have a car, and the city was a gridlocked nightmare of sirens and panic. We moved through the shadows of the warehouse district, our heightened senses guiding us through the dark. Every few blocks, we saw them, men in tactical gear with white armbands, moving with a predatory gait that no human could mimic. They weren't looking for evidence. They were looking for a fight. The closer we got to the warehouse district, the thicker the scent of wood smoke and ozone became. When we finally reached the perimeter of the den, the sight made my blood run cold. The heavy steel doors I had admired for their high-tech security were hanging off their hinges. The warm amber light of the interior had been replaced by the flickering, harsh glare of tactical strobes. "Stay low," Brian whispered, his hand finding the small of my back. They'll have sentries on the roof." We climbed a fire escape of an adjacent building, looking down into the main hall. It was a massacre of peace. The leather sofas were shredded, the books burnt, and our people, the elders and the workers who hadn't made the convoy, were zip-tied in the center of the room. The leader, the one with the dead white eyes, was pacing around them, a heavy iron chain wrapped around his fist. "Where is the Alpha?" the butcher roared, his voice echoing off the brick walls. He backhanded one of Brian's oldest advisors, a man who had taught Brian how to read a ledger. "Where is Mace?" I felt Brian shift beside me. Not a physical transformation, we weren't there yet, but a mental one. The CEO was gone. The predator had taken the wheel. He reached for a heavy iron pipe from the fire escape, his knuckles turning white. "Brian, wait," I breathed, grabbing his arm. "There are 20 of them. Why, we need a distraction." "I am the distraction," he growled. He didn't wait for a plan. He vaulted off the fire escape, a 3-story drop that would have shattered human legs. He landed in the center of the skylight, the glass exploding inward in a rain of crystalline shards. He hit the floor like a comet, the shockwave of his landing sending the butcher's sentries flying. I didn't hesitate. I followed him down, sliding down a support pillar and landing in a crouch beside him. My claws were out, my teeth bared, the fierce protagonist finally shedding the last of her Chanel armor. The butcher turned, a slow, hideous grin spreading across his face. There he is, the billionaire wolf, and he brought his bitch. I'm the one who's going to sign your death warrant, I snapped, stepping forward. But as the butcher raised his chain, a red dot appeared on Brian's chest, then another on mine. Marcus was right, the butcher chuckled. You're both so predictable. Did you really think I'd fight fair? From the shadows of the upper mezzanine, Marcus stepped into the light, holding a remote detonator. The den was always a liability, Brian. It's time for an urban renewal project. He pressed the button. Chapter 12. The Iron Cage. The explosion wasn't at the foundation. It was in the ceiling. Marcus had rigged the support beams to collapse, turning the sanctuary into an iron and brick cage. The sound was a physical weight, out the deafening roar of rending metal that drowned out the butcher's laughter. I lunged for the nearest captive, shielding the elderly advisor with my own body as the mezzanine groaned and buckled overhead. Dust and pulverized mortar filled the air, turning the tactical strobes into eerie, blinding searchlights. Through the haze, I saw Brian. He was holding up a massive steel girder with his bare shoulders, his muscles screaming under the weight of several tons of debris. And he was the only thing keeping the roof from crushing our people. Get them out, Stella, he roared. His voice strained, the veins in his neck bulging like thick cables. Go! I'm not leaving you, I shouted, even as I began slicing through the zip ties of the captives with my claws. The butcher's men didn't stay to fight. They were mercenaries, not martyrs. They were already slipping out through the side exits as the building continued to groan. Marcus was gone, likely heading back to the safety of the tower to watch the demolition on a monitor. Only the butcher remained, standing by the exit, watching Brian struggle with a look of pure, clinical interest. Impressive, the butcher said, his white eyes reflecting the orange glow of a small fire starting in the corner. But even an alpha's spine has a breaking point. He raised a heavy tactical crossbow, aiming it directly at Brian's exposed side. He wasn't going for a kill shot. And he wanted to disable the pillar holding up the room. I didn't think. I grabbed a jagged piece of shattered glass from the floor and launched it like a disc. It caught the butcher across his cheek, drawing a line of dark blood. He snarled, his aim wavering as he fired. The bolt whistled past Brian, embedding itself in the brick wall. Your fight is with me, you coward, I screamed, stepping between him and Brian. The butcher dropped the crossbow and unwound the iron chain from his fist. Do you want to play alpha, little girl? Let's see how you handle the Yukon style. He swung the chain. I ducked, the heavy links whistling over my head and shattering a wooden crate behind me. I was faster, but he had the reach and the weight. I moved in close, under his guard, driving my elbow into his ribs, but it was like hitting a brick wall. He grabbed my hair, his grip like a vice, and slammed me against a support pillar. Stars exploded in my vision, and my mask of corporate coldness didn't just crack, it shattered. I felt a raw, primal heat rise from my gut, a level of aggression I had spent my life suppressing. I didn't pull away. I leaned in, my teeth finding the soft flesh of his shoulder. I bit down, hard, tasting the metallic tang of his blood. He let out a roar of pain and threw me across the room. I hit a stack of pallets, the wood splintering under my weight. Stella, Brian's voice was a ragged gasp. He was sinking lower, and the girder beginning to tilt. The butcher wiped the blood from his shoulder, his eyes now glowing a terrifying, icy blue. He started toward me, the chain rattling. But he stopped when a new sound echoed through the warehouse. A rhythmic, heavy thudding from the river entrance. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't the feds. The Mace pack had arrived. Not the executives in suits, but the dock workers and the truckers, the ones who didn't care about the merger. And they looked hungry. But the butcher took one look at the 30 shadows filling the doorway and backed away toward the rear exit. This isn't over, Mace. The senator still has the keys to your city. He vanished into the smoke. I scrambled to my feet, rushing to Brian's side. Together with the new arrivals, we braced the beam with heavy jacks from the carport, finally allowing Brian to drop the weight. He fell to his knees, gasping for air, his skin covered in gray dust and sweat. I knelt beside him, pulling his head to my chest. We have to go. The feds will be here in minutes. Not yet, Brian said, clutching my hand. He looked at the advisor we had saved, who was holding a small, encrypted drive. The butcher didn't just come to kill. He came to steal the Mace client list, but he got the wrong drive. I looked at the drive. What's on it? The real audit, Brian whispered. The one Marcus used to frame us. It has his signature on every illegal transaction. But there's a catch. What catch? It's biometric. It requires a Blackwood's blood to open, and Marcus knows that. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I have your brother, Stella, the real one. Meet me at the bridge in 10 minutes, or I start sending him back to you piece by piece. It was the senator. Chapter 13. The Bridge of Sighs. The Chicago sky was a bruised purple, the smoke from the warehouse fires mingling with a low-hanging fog that clung to the river. The bridge, a massive Gothic iron structure, was a skeleton in the mist. Brian and I stood at the edge of the shadows, the cold wind whipping my hair across my face. My hand was buried in my pocket, clutching the biometric drive. My blood was the key, but my life was the price. It's a trap, Stella, Brian said, his voice a low vibration that thrummed through the soles of my feet. He was standing too still, his body coiled like a spring. The senator doesn't care about the drive. He wants the distraction. He's moving the Mace assets to an offshore account as we speak. I know, I said, looking at the center of the bridge where a single black car sat idling. But he has Marcus. And as much as I want to kill my brother myself, I won't let a human politician use him as a lab rat. I'll go high, Brian said, nodding toward the iron girders of the bridge's superstructure. When you get to the car, give me the signal. Brian, I said, catching his sleeve. I pulled him close, the scent of him, heart now sharp with adrenaline and salt, filling my senses. I kissed him, hard and desperate. A vow made in the middle of a war zone. Don't blink. Never, he promised. I walked toward the car, my bare feet silent on the cold asphalt. The wind howled through the iron cables, sounding like 1,000 ghosts. As I reached the vehicle, the rear window rolled down. The senator sat there, looking as polished and untouchable as if he were sitting in a televised debate. Beside him, Marcus was slumped, at his face a mess of bruises, his eyes vacant. They'd drugged him. The drive, Ms. Blackwood, the senator said, extending a gloved hand. And perhaps we can discuss a pardon for your unique condition. The drive for my brother, I said, holding up the small device. I pressed my thumb to the sensor, the small light turning a steady, pulsing red as it tasted my DNA. But first, I want to know why. Why destroy the two most powerful companies in the city? Power is only useful if it's controlled, Stella, he said, with a thin, reedy smile. You and Mr. Mace were becoming a variable I couldn't account for. Now, the drive. I stepped closer, the drive humming in my hand. Here. As he reached for it, I felt the air shift. A shadow dropped from the sky. Brian hit the roof of the car with the force of a falling building. The metal buckled, the windows exploding outward in a spray of diamonds. When I dived for the open window, my hand grabbing Marcus's collar and hauling him out just as Brian ripped the car door off its hinges like it was made of wet cardboard. Stella, get him back, Brian roared, turning his attention to the senator's security detail, who were pouring out of a second vehicle. I dragged Marcus toward the edge of the bridge, but a heavy hand caught my shoulder. It wasn't a Fed. It was the butcher. He had survived the warehouse, and he looked like he had crawled out of hell. His white eyes were wide with a manic, drug-induced frenzy. The girl is mine, he screamed, swinging his chain. I spun, using Marcus as a shield for a split second, before shoving him toward the safety of the girders. I met the butcher head-on, my claws raking across his chest. He didn't even flinch. He wrapped the chain around my throat, pulling me back against his chest. The world began to dim as the iron links bit into my skin. I struggled, my hands clawing at his arms, but he was too strong. Brian, I choked out. Brian turned, his eyes glowing a blinding, incandescent gold. He saw the chain around my neck and let out a sound that wasn't a growl. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated primal fury. He didn't run, he launched himself across the bridge. But the senator wasn't finished. He pulled a small silver remote from his pocket, the same frequency as Marcus's disruptor, but amplified 100 times by the bridge's iron cables. As he pressed the button, the entire bridge began to hum with a lethal, high-pitched frequency. Brian fell mid-stride, his hands over his ears, his body convulsing as the sound was amplified by the very metal he was standing on. I fell too, the butcher's grip loosening as he also succumbed to the noise. Through the haze of pain, I saw the senator walk calmly toward the edge of the bridge, the biometric drive in his hand. He looked down at us with a cold, detached pity. It's a shame, he said. You would have made a fascinating study. He tossed the drive into the dark, rushing waters of the river below. Now, he said, looking at the butcher, finish them, all of them. The butcher stood up, his white eyes fixed on me, the chain rattling as he stepped over Brian's prone body. Wait, Marcus's voice came from the shadows. weak but clear. He was holding a small black cylinder, my father's private failsafe. The drive wasn't the only thing with my DNA, Marcus whispered. And he twisted the cylinder. The bridge didn't explode. It began to move. The massive iron gears of the drawbridge groaned into life, the center span beginning to rise, tilting us all toward the dark, hungry water. Stella, Brian shouted, reaching for me as the asphalt began to incline. Chapter 14. The Gravity of Choice. The iron beneath my palms groaned, a deep tectonic shriek as the bridge's massive gears fought against decades of rust. Marcus's failsafe hadn't just triggered the drawbridge, and it had turned the world vertical. Gravity, once a reliable constant, became my primary enemy. I felt my bare feet slip on the slick asphalt as the center span tilted toward the sky, aiming us all directly into the black, churning throat of the Chicago River. Brian was sliding, even with his alpha strength returning. The sonic frequency coming from the senator's remote was scrambling his motor functions, turning his powerful limbs into lead. He clawed at the rising deck, his nails leaving deep gouges in the metal, but the incline was too steep. "Stella," he roared, his voice nearly drowned out by the scream of the machinery. I didn't think about the fall. I didn't think about the senator or the drive lost in the depths. I lunged, my hand catching an iron rivet on a support beam as I threw my other arm out, catching Brian's wrist just as he began a terminal slide toward the edge. The jolt nearly tore my shoulder from its socket. I let out a jagged cry, and my muscles knotting with a strength that felt less like biology and more like pure, unadulterated desperation. The butcher wasn't so lucky. The sonic frequency that had leveled Brian had hit the northern mercenary even harder, his Yukon-bred senses overwhelmed by the urban amplification. He lost his footing, his heavy iron chain rattling uselessly against the asphalt as he tumbled backward. He didn't scream. He just looked at me with those dead white eyes, and a flicker of genuine shock crossing his face before he vanished into the fog and the freezing water below. "The remote, Stella," Brian gasped, his weight a crushing pull on my arm. "The frequency, I can't reach him." I looked up. The senator was standing on the stationary part of the bridge, safe from the rising span. He looked down at us with the detached interest of a boy watching ants drown in a puddle. He was still holding the silver device, his thumb poised to increase the output. But I looked at Marcus. My brother was wedged into a junction of the girders, his face pale, but he was watching me. He knew what he'd done. He'd given us a chance to die on our own terms rather than in a lab. "Let go of him, Stella," Marcus called out, his voice thin against the wind. "You can save yourself. You can climb up." "I don't leave my people, Marcus," I screamed back. "Not even the ones who betray me." I looked at Brian. His eyes were wide, the gold fading into a dull, pained amber. He was losing his grip on his own consciousness. If the senator increased the frequency, his heart would stop. I made a choice. I didn't climb up. I let go of the rivet. We didn't fall into the water, not yet. We slid, our bodies tangled together, gaining velocity until we hit the safety barrier at the very edge of the rising span. The impact knocked the wind out of me, but I didn't stop moving. I reached into my waistband and pulled out the one thing I'd kept hidden. The heavy marble ethics trophy Brian had used to smash the drone. It was a jagged shard of stone now, sharp and heavy. I didn't aim for the senator. I aimed for the iron cables connecting the span to the bridge's power grid. I threw it with every ounce of fury I had left. The marble struck the junction box. A massive arc of blue electricity erupted, a blinding flash that shorted out the entire bridge's lighting and, more importantly, the senator's frequency transmitter. The silence that followed was deafening. The span stopped rising, frozen at a terrifying 45-degree angle. I looked up through the smoke. The senator was gone, vanished into the fog as his security detail realized the game had changed. But as I pulled Brian closer to me, the bridge began to tremble again, not from gears. The cables were snapping. One by one, the iron strands that held the span were fraying under the uneven weight. "Stella," Brian whispered, his hand finding mine in the dark. "We're going in." The bridge gave way. Chapter 15. The Surface Tension. The fall was an eternity of cold air and the sound of snapping steel. We hit the water not as individuals, but as a single mass of heat and defiance. The Chicago River in February is not a liquid. It is a solid wall of ice that shatters against your skin. The impact drove the air from my lungs, the darkness of the depths swallowing us instantly. I pushed upward, my limbs feeling like they were made of lead. The current was a violent, unseen hand, dragging us toward the lake. I broke the surface, gasping, my lungs burning as if I'd inhaled fire. I looked for Brian, but the water was a chaotic mess of bridge debris and churning foam. "Brian!" I screamed, my voice barely a croak. A hand erupted from the water, grabbing the edge of a floating wooden pallet. Brian pulled himself up, his movements slow and agonizing. He looked like a ghost, his skin gray, or his eyes dark. He reached out, grabbing my jacket and hauling me onto the makeshift raft. "We have to move," he panted, the water dripping from his hair. "The senator's people. They'll have boats." "Marcus," I said, looking back at the bridge. The stationary span was empty. He didn't jump. "Marcus made his choice, Stella," Brian said, his voice hardening. "He stayed to ensure the bridge didn't reset. He's either in the water or in a cage by now. But we can't go back for him." I looked at the shoreline. The city was still dark, but the red and blue lights were converging on the bridge site. We were being hunted in a city that used to belong to us. I looked at Brian, and for the first time, I saw the toll the night had taken. He wasn't the invincible CEO anymore. He was a man who had been poisoned, crushed, and drowned, all for a merger he hadn't even wanted. "Why did you do it, Brian?" I asked, my voice trembling with cold. "Why didn't you just let me fall?" He looked at me, and the amber in his eyes flared back to life. A low burning ember of pure, stubborn devotion. "Because you're the only person who ever looked at the wolf and the man and didn't see two different things. You're the merger, Stella, not the paperwork. You." He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. The heat radiating off him was the only thing keeping the hypothermia at bay. In the middle of the river, surrounded by the ruins of our empires, the rivalry felt like a fever dream from another life. "We're going to the Mace docks," he whispered. "I have a safe house in the tunnels. We disappear, we rebuild." "No," I said, pulling back just enough to look him in the eyes. "We don't disappear. That's what Marcus did. That's what the senator expects. We're going back to the tower. Stella, it's a fortress. They have the feds, the butchers' leftovers. I'm in the law on their side." "They have the law," I said, a slow, dangerous smile touching my lips. "But I have the one thing the senator forgot, the biometric drive he threw into the river. He thought it was the only copy." "You made another?" "I'm a Blackwood, Brian. We don't just have a plan B, we have a kill switch." The pallet bumped against a concrete pylon beneath a derelict pier. We climbed out, our bodies stiff and aching. As we moved into the shadows of the warehouse district, a low, was moving toward the Mace docks. There was moving toward the Mace docks. "They're gassing the district," Brian hissed, grabbing my hand. "They're not arresting the pack anymore. They're exterminating." The sky above the docks turned a sickly, glowing green. Chapter 16. The Green Mist. The air tasted like copper and old pennies. Yet the senator wasn't playing the long game anymore. He was burning the evidence. The green mist rolling over the Mace docks wasn't just gas. It was a weaponized neural agent, a cousin to the V9, designed to trigger a violent, uncontrollable shift in anyone with the wolf gene. It was a massacre disguised as a biological disaster. "Don't breathe it in," Brian shouted, tearing a strip of fabric from his shirt and soaking it in a puddle of rainwater. He pressed it against my face, his hands steady despite the chaos unfolding around us. We could hear the screams from the docks, the sound of our people, the dock workers and the families, being forced into their primal forms in the middle of a tactical sweep. The feds would claim they were protecting the city from rabid beasts. "We have to stop the dispersal," I said through the fabric, my eyes stinging. "The central hub is in the old Mace pumping station." We moved through the mist like ghosts. My senses were screaming, and the wolf beneath my skin pacing frantically, desperate to claw its way out and fight the poison. Brian was worse. He was the primary alpha. Every breath he took was a battle for his sanity. His skin was flushed, his eyes a brilliant, agonizing gold. "I can hold it," he grounded out, his footsteps heavy. "Get to the controls, Stella. I'll keep them off you." We reached the pumping station, a brick and iron relic that groaned under the pressure of the gas being pumped through its veins. With a sudden, violent burst of speed, a shadow in the green fog. He didn't shift, but he didn't have to. He hit the first guard with the force of a battering ram, the man's helmet cracking against the brick wall. The second guard fired, but Brian was already inside his reach, his hands catching the rifle and snapping it like a twig. "Ikago!" Brian roared, his voice sounding more like a predator's every second. I burst into the station. The machinery was a roar of white noise. I found the main console, my fingers flying over the keys. It was locked with a Mace encryption, but I didn't need the code. I needed the logic. I bypassed the security layers, my mind working with a cold, desperate efficiency. "Stella!" Brian's voice came from the doorway. He was leaning against the frame, his body shaking. The gas was winning. "It's almost there," I shouted. I found the emergency vent. If I opened it, the gas would be sucked back into the underground storage tanks, but it would create a vacuum that would implode the station. "Brian, get out, it's going to blow." Not without you, I hit the final sequence. The floor beneath me buckled. The roar of the pumps changed from a scream to a low, heavy thrum. The green mist began to recede from the doorway, sucked back into the earth. I ran for the exit, and but a figure stepped out from behind the massive iron tanks. It wasn't a guard, it was the butcher. He was drenched in river water, his white eyes bloodshot, his skin covered in chemical burns. He looked like he had died and crawled back out of the hell. "You," I breathed. "The Alpha dies tonight," the butcher rasped, his voice a ruined crawl. "And you'll watch." He didn't go for me. He lunged for Brian, who was too weak to dodge. The iron chain wrapped around Brian's throat, pulling him back into the shadows of the machinery. "Brian!" I didn't reach for a tool. I reached for the one thing Marcus had taught me before he turned. I reached for the pressure valve on the main tank. "Butcher!" I screamed. He turned, and I pulled the lever. A jet of pure, concentrated neutralizer sprayed directly into his face. He shrieked, the chemical blinding his white eyes. He released Brian, clawing at his face as he stumbled back toward the imploding pumps. I grabbed Brian, hauling him toward the door just as the first iron support beam snapped. We tumbled out into the wet asphalt of the alleyway as the pumping station collapsed behind us in a heap of brick and twisted metal. The green mist was gone, the air was clear. But as I looked up, I saw the senator's helicopter hovering directly above us. A loudspeaker crackled. "Ms. Blackwood, Mr. Mace, your resistance has been noted, but you've forgotten one thing." The helicopter's spotlight hit the ruins of the station. And in there, standing in the wreckage of the doorway, was my father. But he wasn't dead, and he wasn't Sterling anymore. He was a hulking, mindless beast of gray fur and rage, his eyes the same cold, dead white as the butcher's. "Behold," the senator's voice echoed, "the new CEO of Blackwood Holdings." Chapter 17, The Apex Protocol. The thing that had been my father let out a sound that tore through the night, a hollow, vibrating roar that had no humanity left in it. And he stood nearly 7 feet tall, his expensive charcoal suit shredded into rags that hung off a frame of corded, unnatural muscle. The V9 hadn't killed him. It had erased him, leaving behind a blank slate of primal aggression. He was the senator's perfect weapon, an alpha with no conscience, no history, and no mercy. Brian struggled to his feet, his hand gripping a rusted pipe for support. He looked at the beast, his own gold eyes reflecting a deep, mournful recognition. "He's gone, Stella. That's not a man. That's a biological puppet." "I know," I whispered, my heart feeling like it was being squeezed by a cold hand. I stepped in front of Brian, my own claws sliding out with a lethal click. "Senator, you wanted a monster? You're looking at the wrong one." The helicopter hovered low, the downdraft from the rotors whipping my hair into a frenzy. The senator was visible in the open bay door, holding a tablet. Get the remote control for the neural implants they'd clearly jammed into my father's spine. "Kill them," the senator commanded, his finger tapping the screen. The beast lunged. It didn't move like a wolf. It moved like a machine. It slammed into the pavement where we had been standing a second before, the concrete spider webbing under the impact. I rolled to the left, Brian to the right. We were outmatched, outsized, and exhausted. "We have to get the remote," I shouted over the roar of the rotors. "I'll draw him off," Brian replied. He let out a sharp, piercing whistle, the Mace challenge. The beast turned, its white eyes locking onto Brian. It saw the alpha threat and reacted with a violent, singular focus. It charged, a wall of fur and fury. Brian met it head-on, using the rusted pipe to block a massive clawed swipe that would have decapitated a human. I didn't watch the fight. I looked at the helicopter. It was hovering barely 15 feet off the ground. I ran, and I didn't head for the stairs of the nearby warehouse. I headed for the wreckage of the pumping station. I climbed a twisted iron girder, my bare feet finding purchase on the jagged metal. I vaulted from the ruins, my fingers catching the landing skid of the helicopter. The aircraft lurched. I swung my body up, my muscles screaming, and hauled myself into the bay. The senator didn't even have time to look up from his tablet. I was on him in a second, my hand catching his throat and slamming him against the bulkhead. The tablet clattered to the floor. "Stella," he gasped, his face turning a mottled purple. You can't, the law." "I am the law tonight," I hissed, my face inches from his. "And I'm filing a motion for summary judgment." I didn't kill him. I didn't have to. I grabbed the tablet and smashed it against the edge of the doorway. Below us, the beast suddenly stopped mid-swing. It let out a confused, pained whine, its head lolling as the neural link snapped. It looked at Brian, then up at the helicopter. For a brief, flickering second, I saw a flash of the old Sterling in those white eyes, a moment of clarity, of horror, and of shame. The beast turned and looked at the senator. It didn't roar, it just lunged, it jumped, its massive claws catching the skid of the helicopter. The aircraft tilted violently, the pilot screaming as the weight of the Alpha began to pull the machine toward the ground. "Jump! Heck, Stella!" Brian's voice drifted up from the alley. I looked at the senator, then at the beast that used to be my father. I didn't say goodbye. I dived. I hit a stack of industrial pallets, the wood breaking my fall but sending a jolt of agony through my ribs. I scrambled out of the way just as the helicopter clipped the side of the warehouse and spiraled into the river in a spectacular ball of fire and twisted metal. Silence returned to the docks, broken only by the crackle of the flames. Brian was there, pulling me to my feet. We stood together, watching the spot where the helicopter had gone down. There was no sign of the senator. There was no sign of the beast. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice trembling. "No," Brian said, looking toward the city skyline. The lights were beginning to flicker back on, one block at a time. The blackout was over. The feds are still coming. Marcus is still in the wind. And the world knows what we are now. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wet device, the biometric drive. "I thought the senator threw this in the river," I said. "He threw a decoy," Brian said, a tired smile touching his lips. "I switched them when I hit the car roof. I'm an alpha, Stella. I don't just fight, I plan." I looked at the drive, then at the man beside me. We were covered in blood, soot, and river water. We had no company, no home, and a city that feared us. "So," I said, leaning my head against his shoulder. "What's the first move of the new merger?" Brian looked at the drive, then at the dawn beginning to break over the lake. "We stopped playing by their rules," he said. His phone buzzed. A news alert. Breaking. Anonymous leak reveals evidence of federal corruption and illegal biological testing. CEO Stella Blackwood named as whistleblower. I looked at the screen, then at Brian. "You leaked it." "I had a scheduled upload," he said. "Nart in case I didn't make it off the bridge." We stood there as the sun rose, the most powerful and most wanted people in Chicago. "Stella," Brian whispered, turning me to face him. He leaned in, his lips brushing mine. "I think I love being in business with you." "Get in line, Mace," I said, before pulling him into a kiss that tasted like victory and a very dangerous future. But as we turned to walk away, a shadow moved in the ruins of the pumping station. A hand reached out of the rubble, a hand wearing a Blackwood signet ring, and it wasn't gray. Chapter 18. The Final Audit. The hand rising from the rubble was too clean, the signet ring catching the first rays of the Chicago sun with a mocking golden glint. It wasn't the claw of a beast or the scarred remains of a mercenary. It was a manicured hand, steady and cold. Marcus. He climbed out of the hollowed shell of the pumping station, hat shaking the brick dust from his tactical jacket as if he were simply stepping out of a cab at the opera. He looked at the smoking wreck of the helicopter in the river, then at us. There was no remorse in his eyes, only the analytical detachment of a man who had already moved on to the next set of calculations. "He was never going to survive the transition, Stella," Marcus said, his voice flat, unaffected by the freezing wind. "Father was too set in the old ways. As he lacked the neural plasticity for the V9. You, on the other hand, you were always the superior model." I stepped forward, the adrenaline finally ebbing and leaving behind a bone-deep, icy clarity. "The model is discontinued, Marcus. The feds are burned. The senator is at the bottom of the river, and Brian just leaked every bit of evidence you spent 5 years gathering." Marcus tilted his head, a small patronizing smile touching his lips. "Evidence is just data, sister. And data can be overwritten. You think a whistleblower leak stops the gears of a global machine? You've merely forced a restructuring." Brian moved to my side, his presence a heavy, grounding heat. He didn't growl. He didn't have to. The air around him was thick with the scent of an alpha who had reclaimed his territory. The machine is broken, Marcus. The Mace and Blackwood packs aren't fighting for your scraps anymore. We're the ones holding the contracts now. It's like you have nothing but a ring and a dead man's name. I have the legacy, Marcus countered, his gaze shifting to the biometric drive in Brian's hand. And I have the patience you both lack. This wasn't a war for the tower, you fools. It was a test of the merger's durability. You passed. Congratulations. He turned, walking toward a black sedan that had materialized at the end of the industrial block, its headlights cutting through the morning fog like the eyes of a deep-sea predator. And he didn't run, he didn't hide. He simply left, a ghost returning to the shadows of the world's elite, leaving us with the ruins of our old lives and the foundation of a terrifying new one. Let him go, I whispered, as Brian started to follow. I caught his arm, my fingers tangling with his. He's a ghost now, and we have a city to rebuild. We stood on the pier for a long time, watching the sun climb over the jagged skyline of Chicago. The smoke from the warehouse district was a thin, gray ribbon against the blue. The hostile takeover was over, but the merger was just beginning. We weren't just the heads of two companies anymore. We were the architects of a new kind of pack, one that didn't need a moon goddess or ancient prophecies to know that we belonged together. You realize we're officially the most wanted people in the country, Brian said, his voice a low, intimate rumble. He pulled me against his side, his arm a solid weight across my shoulders. Hey, the feds will spend the next 10 years trying to prove we exist. Let them try, I said, leaning my head against him. I looked at my reflection in the dark water of the river. The suit was gone, the Chanel was a memory, and my face was smeared with ash and blood. I looked fierce. I looked real. I've spent my whole life hiding what I am. I think I'd like to see them try to catch me now. Brian turned me to face him, his amber eyes glowing with a soft, enduring light. He didn't say anything. I walked away from the river, toward the heart of the city that was waking up to a world it didn't yet understand. The glass towers were still there, the boardrooms were still waiting, and the hunt would never truly end. But as I gripped Brian's hand, I knew that whatever came next, whether it was Marcus's return or a new audit, we would face it as a single, unbreakable unit. The merger was finalized, and for the first time in my life, the audit was clean.